All right, back for another deep dive. And today we're tackling something a lot of you have been asking about.
Yeah.
Thinking directly in English. You guys have sent in some really cool research on this. And
Yeah, some fascinating stuff.
I got to admit, I'm pretty curious to get into it. Basically, we're talking about moving beyond translating in your head and how that impacts fluency.
Yeah. It's a bigger deal than most people realize. You can think of it like, imagine your brain is a highway system. And when you're translating every thought, every word, it's all being forced through a single toll booth.
Oh.
Like a mental bottleneck.
Wow, yeah.
And that slows you down, creates those traffic jams in your speech, and it really limits how smoothly you can express yourself.
I love that analogy. I can totally relate to that bottleneck feeling, especially when I'm trying to speak in a new language. It's like, all my thoughts are ready to go,
Yeah.
but they're stuck in the hallway, waiting for that translator to let them out one by one. So how does thinking directly in English, how does that actually bypass this bottleneck?
Well, you're essentially creating new highways in your brain, ones that are specifically for English. One of the sources you sent in mentioned that learners who stop translating can speak up to 43% faster.
Wow.
It makes sense, though, right? If those thoughts don't have to go through that single toll booth.
Makes sense to me.
But what's really interesting is that it also seems to impact the quality of those thoughts as well.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's not just speed, it's about how those thoughts are formed and expressed.
Exactly.
I can see how that would make your speech more natural and fluent.
Precisely. One of the studies you sent over described it as like rewiring the brain.
Rewiring.
Yeah.
Interesting.
When you're consistently thinking in English, you're strengthening those neural pathways, making them more efficient, and ultimately making English a more natural part of how you think.
Okay, so the why of it is becoming really clear. But how do we actually make that shift? From translating to thinking directly in English, is it really as simple as just telling ourselves to think in English?
I wish it were that easy. But it's more about creating the right conditions for your brain to make that shift. One of your sources suggests a really simple technique, narrating your daily activities in English.
So like walking around my house saying, I am making coffee, the sun is shining, my cat is judging me.
Exactly. It might sound a little silly, but it's really about laying the groundwork. You start to associate everyday actions and thoughts with their English equivalents. It's almost like building this readily accessible mental dictionary. And the research on this is pretty cool. One learner from Japan reported noticeable improvements in just a few weeks.
Wow, just from doing that.
Yeah.
That's encouraging. But wouldn't that only really cover concrete actions? What about more abstract ideas? Or like expressing emotions in English?
That's where another technique comes in, visual thinking.
Okay.
And this one might seem a little counterintuitive, but it's about bypassing translation by directly associating English words with their meanings through imagery.
Okay, I'm listening.
So instead of thinking arbol and then tree, you just picture a tree in your mind and think tree.
Got it. But what about more complex concepts like happiness or democracy?
Yeah.
How do you picture those?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. That's why it's called visual thinking, not just picturing.
Right.
So the visual can be literal, like seeing a tree, but it can also involve other senses or emotions.
Interesting.
So for happiness, you may not see a picture, but you might feel a sense of warmth or recall a joyful memory, whatever evokes that feeling for you.
Makes sense.
The key is to have that direct connection between the word and its meaning without needing to translate.
So creating this multisensory experience, that triggers the English word directly.
Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense.
And the research backs it up. Learners who practice visual thinking have shown a huge improvement in word recall and fluency, sometimes even more than those who rely on traditional translation.
Okay, so we've got narrating our daily activities and visual thinking. Those sound like some great starting points. Any other practical steps someone can take to start rewiring their brain?
Yeah, one of the most impactful things is something all your sources emphasized: immersing yourself in real-world English scenarios.
Okay.
And this doesn't mean you have to move to an English-speaking country.
Right.
It's more about creating opportunities for your brain to encounter and process English naturally.
So instead of just studying vocab lists, you're actually using the language in situations where it matters.
Yes. And one of the easiest ways to do this is by just finding everyday interactions where you can use English, like ordering your coffee, asking for directions, or just having a short conversation with someone.
So pushing yourself beyond the comfortable study sessions. and actually applying what you're learning.
Exactly. It's like taking those new mental highways you built.
Yeah.
And actually driving on them.
I like that.
It can feel a little daunting at first.
Oh, for sure.
But one of your sources told a story.
That, I think, shows how powerful this can be.
Oh.
Well, I love a good story.
This learner used to translate everything in their head when ordering food.
Oh, yeah.
Which made it really stressful.
Yeah, I bet.
But they started practicing different scenarios, imagining themselves in the restaurant, thinking about what they'd say and the questions they might be asked. And eventually, they could order fluently without translating. It became second nature.
Wow, that's a great example of how even practice in small situations can make a big difference.
Yeah, it's all about building those pathways and strengthening them through use. And that's where the real magic starts to happen. It's not just speaking faster. It's about thinking more freely, expressing yourself more authentically, and ultimately just feeling more confident.
It's giving me so much to think about, and I'm sure our listener is too. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I'd love to hear a bit more about the science behind all this. What's going on in our brains when we make this shift?
That's a great question, and it's something your sources go into in detail. It seems that this rewiring process actually leads to some pretty big changes in how we process information and even how we see the world around us.
Whoa, that sounds complex. Let's take a quick pause here so you, the listener, can process what we've talked about so far.
Sounds good.
Think about your own experiences with English. Have you felt that bottleneck we mentioned? Or maybe you've had moments where you thought or spoke in English without translating.
Yeah.
Take a moment to reflect on those experiences because they're full of insight into how your brain learns language. We'll be right back to explore the science behind this rewiring process. Don't go anywhere.
All right, so we're back, and I'm ready to get into the science of all this, the cognitive science behind thinking in English.
Yeah, me too. This is the part that I imagine gets pretty complex.
It is. It is, but one of the sources you sent over, a report from Cambridge University, they break it down in a way that's easy to understand. They talk about how our brains actually develop specific neural pathways for our native language early in life. And those pathways become so ingrained, almost like well-worn paths in a forest.
Okay, so when we try to learn a new language as adults, we're essentially trying to create new paths through this really dense forest.
Exactly. And it takes work. At first, we rely on those native language pathways, which is why translation feels so natural.
Right.
But the Cambridge study, it found that when you consistently think in English, you strengthen new pathways, ones that are independent of those original ones.
So we're building like a whole new infrastructure in our brains for English.
That's a great way to put it.
But the report also mentioned that this rewiring, it can go beyond just language. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, one of the most interesting findings is that thinking in English can actually impact how we understand information and even how we categorize it. There's even evidence that suggests it can shift our understanding of concepts like time and space.
Whoa, hold on. Are you saying that thinking in English could change how I see the world?
It's a real possibility. For example, some languages, they have really specific words for directions, like north, south, east, and west, and speakers of those languages, they tend to have a much stronger sense of spatial awareness, and they navigate more easily. So as you think more in English, you might start to notice subtle shifts in how you perceive your surroundings.
Wow. That is mind-blowing. I'm really starting to see why this is so much more than fluency. It's almost like rewiring your brain to experience the world.
Through an English lens.
That's exactly it. It's about integrating the language into your very being, not treating it like some kind of external code you have to crack. I get it. But I imagine this rewiring process, it's not always a walk in the park. What are some of the challenges people might face when they're trying to make this shift?
Well, one of the biggest ones is overcoming the habit of translating. It's so deeply ingrained.
Right.
It's like trying to break free from those paths in the forest, you know, the way. But it takes real conscious effort to forge a new one.
And I bet it's tempting to slip back into those old habits.
Yeah.
Especially when you're tired or stressed.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's the challenge of those moments when you just don't know the word for something. It's so easy to get frustrated.
I've definitely been there. What advice would you give someone who's struggling with those moments?
Well, first of all, be patient.
Yeah.
This is a process. It takes time and effort. It's not about being perfect overnight. It's about making progress. Celebrate the small wins, like when you catch yourself thinking in English without even realizing it.
So shifting the focus from fluency to progress.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And when you hit those roadblocks, when you can't find the right word, don't give up. See them as chances to learn.
I like that.
One of your sources had a really good tip for this.
Right.
Instead of going straight for the dictionary, try to describe the word. Using other English words you already know, it's like building a bridge with the materials you have.
Interesting.
You might be surprised by how much you can communicate, even with a limited vocabulary.
That's a great strategy. It keeps you thinking in English, even when you feel stuck. But aside from these individual efforts, are there any external things that can help or hurt this process?
That's a great point. The environment you create for yourself plays a huge role.
So it's not just what's happening in our heads, but also the world we surround ourselves with.
Exactly. One of the sources you sent, it really highlighted the importance of surrounding yourself with English as much as possible.
Like what kinds of things?
Things like listening to English music or podcasts, watching movies and shows, reading books, or even just talking with English speakers.
So creating a kind of English immersion experience.
Exactly. It helps those mental pathways feel more familiar.
But I imagine there's a balance. You don't want to overwhelm yourself.
You're right. One of the sources cautioned against forcing it. It's about finding what you enjoy and what you can keep up with. If you love music, make an English playlist. If you like movies, watch English films. It's about incorporating English into what you already enjoy.
I love that, making it feel like a natural part of your life.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't about being perfect. It's about growing, enriching how you communicate, and feeling more connected to the world.
Those are some great benefits.
Yeah.
So we've covered the challenges and the importance of environment. What about the long-term benefits? What can someone expect once they've made this shift?
Well, we've talked about fluency and speed, but it goes way beyond that.
You mentioned that it can impact how we see the world.
Yeah, and one of your sources talked about the concept of cognitive flexibility.
Cognitive flexibility.
Yeah. The idea is that thinking in more than one language can make you a more creative and adaptable thinker overall.
So it's like you're giving your brain a workout by forcing it to switch between different ways of thinking.
Exactly. And that can have benefits in other areas of your life too, like problem solving, decision making, even empathy.
Wow. These implications are pretty profound. It's not just about language anymore. It's about personal growth and expanding what your brain can do.
Right. And on a more personal level, a lot of learners say they feel a deeper connection to the English-speaking world. They can understand the humor, the nuances, the cultural references in a way that wasn't possible before.
It's like they're unlocking a whole new level of understanding.
Yeah.
This has given me so much to think about. I think it's time for another pause so our listener can reflect.
Definitely.
So as you're listening to this, what thoughts and feelings are coming up for you? What really stands out to you from your own experiences learning English?
Think about that. Maybe jot down any questions or insights. And as you do, think about how you might apply some of these techniques in your own life. We'll be back in a bit to continue our deep dive.
All right, we're back, and I gotta say, my brain is still buzzing from all these amazing benefits of thinking in English.
It really is incredible how much it can impact different areas of our lives.
Yeah, and as we wrap up our deep dive here, I want to bring it back to you, our listener.
Yeah.
We've gone through a ton of research, but what matters is how you can actually use this stuff.
Yeah.
So for someone listening who's like, okay, I'm ready for this. I'm ready to rewire my brain for English. What are the most important things to remember?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that thinking in English is a skill, not a talent.
Okay.
Something you can develop if you put in the work and use the right strategies.
So it's not about being born with some special ability. It's a choice,
Yeah.
a decision to change how you approach language.
Exactly. And another thing, be patient.
Yeah.
This is a journey. It takes time. There will be times when you get frustrated, times when you feel like you're not getting anywhere.
I think we've all been there.
But every little step forward matters.
It's about celebrating those small wins. Like when you realize you've been thinking in English without trying.
Exactly. And it's important to be strategic, too. You sent us a bunch of research with all sorts of different techniques, narrating your day, using visual thinking, immersing yourself in English.
Right.
It's about finding what works for you.
Creating your own personalized toolkit for your brain.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think one last really important thing.
What's that?
Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
So important.
Mistakes are going to happen. It's how we learn.
Absolutely.
I think so many language learners get caught up in the fear of making mistakes, and it actually stops them from improving.
It's such a common thing. But even native English speakers make mistakes.
Right.
It's how we learn. It's how we get better.
So it's about shifting your focus from being perfect to making progress, seeing those mistakes as opportunities to grow.
I love that.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening for me. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on what it actually means to think in English. But now it's your turn, listener.
Yeah, it's over to you.
Think about what really resonated with you today. What are you most curious about? What's one small step you can take today to start using these techniques?
Maybe you could try narrating your morning routine in English. Or pick one new word each day to practice visual thinking with. Or even just listen to an English podcast while you're doing chores.
Whatever it is, make it your own. This is your journey, and we're here cheering you on.
Remember, you have the power to unlock the world of English. It's all within you, one thought at a time, one step at a time. You can rewire your brain and become fluent in a way you never thought possible.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring. Keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep believing in yourself.
You got this.
Can't wait to see where this journey takes you.
Happy learning.